Let's talk about voting rights. Ever since the 2020 election, which had record voter turnout despite the COVID-19 pandemic, we've seen an unprecedented wave of attacks on the right to vote. This all stems from the big lie, the efforts by Donald Trump and many Republicans to lie about the election being stolen, make up lies about election fraud, and then ultimately attempt to overturn the election. Why was there such high voter turnout in 2020 despite the pandemic? Because many states gave voters the option to cast their ballot in different ways. Across the country, early voting and vote by mail was extended as an option to people who previously were not able to vote in those ways. These additional options are popular amongst most Americans, and practices like early voting and vote by mail do not make our elections any less secure. States like Utah, Colorado, and Washington have been voting almost exclusively by mail for years, and voter fraud is extremely rare in this country. But thanks to a massive disinformation campaign led by the former president and the majority of the Republican Party, states across the country have been introducing new laws aimed at making it more difficult to vote at breakneck speeds. The Brennan Center has said that 49 states have introduced over 400 bills with provisions that make it harder to vote, 30 of which have become laws in 18 different states. That's just insane. While some of these laws will never pass, many might, and we can only rely on lawsuits from people like Mark Elias and the good folks at organizations like Democracy Docket and the ACLU so much. There must be a larger fix to this problem instead of just waiting for laws to pass and then suing the state and hoping that a judge will do the right thing. We need federal protection of voting rights. That's why it's such great news that the Democrats in the House just reintroduced the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. This bill seeks to update the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that acted as a bulwark against voter suppression bills for decades. The main way the Voting Rights Act protected against voter suppression was through a process known as preclearance. The preclearance provision required certain states with a history of racial discrimination and voter suppression to get preclearance from the Department of Justice or the courts before any newly restrictive voting laws could be passed. The Voting Rights Act was effectively able to block discriminatory voting laws before they could be passed. And the preclearance requirement was one of the most powerful tools we had to vet laws and protect against discriminatory voting laws from passing. That all came to a halt in 2013 with a 5-4 Supreme Court decision in Shelby County versus Holder, and effectively gutted the preclearance requirement. The court decided that the formula used to identify which states were required to undergo preclearance was outdated, and therefore the preclearance requirement is no longer enforceable. The late Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg eloquently expressed how ridiculous this decision was in her dissenting opinion. She wrote, "Throwing out preclearance when it has worked and is continuing to work to stop discriminatory changes is like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you're not getting wet." What's incredible is preclearance was working. It wasn't just some relic from a time long ago when our country was much more racist and now is no longer needed. In 2012, just the year before the Shelby County versus Holder decision, the Department of Justice blocked 17 changes to election laws. The John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act would restore the Voting Rights Act by updating the preclearance formula and provide new ways of determining which states would be subjected to preclearance by the DOJ. This bill must pass if we hope to protect our democracy from attacks on voting rights. But it is almost certain that Republicans in the Senate will block this bill like they've blocked other crucially important voting rights bills, such as the For the People Act. That's why Democrats must be willing to amend the filibuster to at least allow for civil rights bills to be exempt from the filibuster. Ideally, we'd amend the filibuster entirely. It's insane that one member of the minority party can literally just send an email to block a bill from ever getting a vote in the Senate. That's not how our government should work. So we need to keep the pressure on. Pick up the phone, send an email, write an op-ed, or a letter to the editor. Make it clear that you support these bills. The House is going to vote on the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act next week. We need to get some Republicans to support the bill. And we need to start putting pressure on the Senate. We need Republican support. But we also need to convince Senate Dems to go around the filibuster to pass these important bills. Let's get it done. And I'll leave you with these words from John Lewis. This is why it's so important that we protect the right to vote.
My dear friends, your vote is precious, almost sacred. It is the most powerful non-violent tool we have to create a more perfect union.